Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Real Theology, a philosophy of religion podcast where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion. I am joined today by two good friends, Matthew Adelstein and Amos. Guys, could you go ahead and introduce yourselves to the audience for the people who may not be familiar with your work?
Sure. So, my name is Matthew. I run the blog Bentham's Bulldog or Bentham's Newsletter, where I write about a variety of topics, including philosophy of religion, ethics, various culture war issues of the day, politics, and whatever else happens to be on my mind. Often, I write about various bizarre things. I'm a student in philosophy currently at Oxford for a year, though my studying abroad, though my home university is the University of Michigan. So yeah, that's basically who I am.
Hi, I'm Amos Wallen. It's a similar story. So I'm a third year philosophy and theology undergrad at Oxford. I also have a Substack going AWOL where I write about similar things to Matthew. Mostly philosophy of religion and ethics, and sometimes politics, and sometimes random bits of satire and nonsense. I also sometimes publish papers / try to publish papers and things that maybe this audience would be interested in.
So one of the things that we like to do here at Real Atheology is to explore models of God that are not traditional models of God. So if you look in the literature in the philosophy of religion, you'll see that it's saturated by what's often called perfect being theism. But Matt and Amos have explored different models of God. Could you tell the audience a little bit about some of the models of God that you find interesting that are not what are traditionally called perfect being theism?
Perfect being theism is the one that I have most of my credence in. I guess other ones are interesting, and there is something attractive about them in that if you think that God is limited or imperfect, you have a better explanation of why there's evil. But I think then you'll lose that unexplanatory power in terms of explaining various features of the world, including the ones relating to the argument that Amos and I are going to be talking about in this episode.
Yeah, so I have a similar view to Matthew, where I've thought about other models of God that aren't perfect, but I'm inclined to say like the best views will be perfect being theism, but it might be that it's perfect being theism plus something else, plus some other special attributes. So one interesting consequence of the argument that we'll talk about today might be that henotheism is true. So henotheism is the view that there's a capital G God, a perfect being who creates or emanates a vast plurality of lowercase g gods. And I think that that's an entailment of the argument that we're going to present today. And so, you might think that sort of sits nicely, maybe with some non-Western models of God, maybe in the Hindu tradition. Although it's also probably going to be compatible with, say, Christianity, right? Because you could just call these lowercase g gods angels and demons and not call them gods for reasons of piety.
Right. The lowercase g gods aren't necessarily, you don't have to think that they're necessarily the sorts of things that count as God that lead you to be a polytheist, where like if you believe in these sort of powerful spirits that are very mortal, it's not clear that you believe in multiple gods, because it's not clear that the lowercase that the thing that theists think of as God picks out these lowercase g gods rather than this single ultimate uncreated being that's the source of everything else.
Yep.
So I've brought Matt and Amos here today to discuss an interesting argument that doesn't get enough attention, I think, in the philosophy of religion circles. I want to say y'all have written an article on this, or y'all are writing an article on this. I don't actually know what the status of the article is.
The article is written, and we're currently trying to get it published. So we have a sort of frustrating situation where the journal,
so it's in that limbo stage.
Reviewers will say we accept, the other reviewer will have a long list of sort of esoteric minor concerns and recommend rejections. So we're still fighting that battle, but the paper's done.
So the argument is called the Anthropic Argument. So I want to kind of turn the stage over to Matt and Amos right now to kind of give us the broad overview of what that argument it is and what you think are the essential steps for people who are just now hearing this argument for the first time, what you think that they should know as far as understanding the argument, whether they're theist or atheist.
Shall I give the kind of Clip Notes version, and then Matthew can explain some of the arguments along the way? So the rough idea is this. So we're going to claim that theories on which more people exist, all else being equal, make your existence in particular more likely. And so given that you exist, you should update in favor of these theories. Right? So, and then we're going to claim that theistic theories allow you to get more people than the best atheistic theories. So, like if you take a sort of plausible theistic model of theistic view, and then, the most plausible theistic views allow you to get more people. And so given that they get you more people, you should update in favor of those theories over the various forms of atheism that we consider.
Yeah. So that's a good summary. Right. So the basic idea is that from the fact that you exist, you get evidence that there are more people. This assumption that says that your existence is likelier if there are more people that exist is known as the self-indication assumption. And then we say that if that's right, then because theism predicts more people on average than atheism, theism will ultimately be more likely. So to get a sense of sort of how this kind of probabilistic reasoning works, suppose that a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person gets created. And if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. The anthropic assumption that we adopt, known as the self-indication assumption, says that upon being created from this process, you should think it's 10 times likelier that the coin came up tails as that it came up heads. Because if there are 10 times as many people that get created, the idea is it's 10 times likelier that you in particular would get created. But if we buy this in the context of coin flips, and I'm happy to give some arguments for the self-indication assumption if people are skeptical of it. If we buy this in the context of coin flips, then let's apply this to theism. Well, so if atheism predicts either a finite number of people or an infinite number of people, but the smallest infinity worth of people, and theism predicts a much larger infinity worth of people, then I think theism will get a probabilistic boost. So the idea is that consider the most people that there could be, the biggest number of people that could possibly exist. On theism, it's pretty likely that that number of people would actually exist. After all, it's good to create, and God has no limit into how much he could create. So God is likely to create the biggest number of people that there could be. It turns out that the biggest number of people that there could be is this really, really large infinity. In fact, it is more than the number of numbers. So on theism, I claim this number of people existing is pretty likely. On atheism, I think that number of people existing is really unlikely. You need kind of an extreme degree of gerrymandering in order to get even a number of people remotely in the vicinity of the most number of people that there could be. And then once you think that, so theism makes it likelier that you get the most number of people that there could be, and then your existence gives you infinitely strong evidence for there being the most number of people that there could be, where the idea is that if there is the most number of people there could be, your existence is infinitely likelier than if there's some smaller number. Because if there's a smaller number, only 0% of possible people would exist. And so then it would be infinitely likely that you would exist. So that's the argument in a nutshell. It's that from the fact that you exist, your existence gives you evidence that there are more people. So you should think that the number of people is the most that there could be. And then if the number of people is the most that there could be, that's more strongly predicted on theism than on atheism, because the most number of people that there could be is some giant infinity, where it's very hard to see how you get that number of people on atheism, but it's easy to see how you get that number of people on theism. And in fact, that number of people existing is positively expected on theism. One just brief clarificatory note. So people are, when you present this argument, a common refrain is, oh, if there are all these people, where are they? The proposal there is that God makes a very large multiverse. Okay, we're not claiming that God stuffed little tiny people in the crevices of Earth or something. The idea is God makes a big multiverse, and in fact, you couldn't actually fit that number of people in a single universe for some technical reasons.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just a quick clarification on the most people there could be. So, the claim is God would create the most people there could be. So you might think that it's possible for God to create all possible people, or you might not. So you might think that that's impossible, or that the locution all possible people for some reason doesn't make sense. Okay, so if you think that it would be possible if God existed to create all possible people, the thought would just be there are a bunch of possible people, God is omnipotent, so for each one of them, he could create them. Seems like a fairly natural thought. then that's what you should say with regard to our argument. If you think that it would be impossible for God to create all possible people, say because the creation of some people would preclude the creation of other people, or because you might think the locution all possible people doesn't make sense, then what we're going to claim is that even if you can't get all possible people for that reason, theism will still let you get more people than atheism, many more people. And so given this, you're still going to get a huge update in favor of theism, or so we claim.
Right. So an analogy, going back to the coin flip case, right? So we talked about the earlier coin flip case where the coin gets flipped, where if it comes up heads, one person gets created, and tails, 10 people get created. And there we think tails is 10 times likelier than heads. But so now consider a different analogy. Imagine that if the coin, so they're bigger and smaller infinities, as the mathematicians tell us. So now imagine if the coin comes up heads, you get a small infinity worth of people get created, or a finite number. Well, if it comes up tails, then you get a much larger infinity worth of people being created. Well, then we think you should be, upon being created, you should be certain that it came up tails, because the idea is that infinitely more people come up on tails than on heads. So it's infinitely likelier that you would get created. And so then we think that that's sort of analogous to the situation between theism and atheism, where theism probably predicts either a finite number of people or a kind of small infinity worth of people. Atheism does, while theism predicts a very large infinity worth of people. So it makes your existence way more likely.
Yeah. So there are kind of like two big claims that we need to argue for in this, right? So, what one is the self-indication assumption, the idea that theories on which there are more people are going to make your existence in particular more likely. And then the other part is that theism does better than atheism in terms of predicting lots of people. So we'll need a positive reason why theism predicts lots of people, and we'll need a reason why atheism, just can't get as many people as theism, at least without some serious gerrymandering.
Right. Now, I think that it's easier to see why the second part is right. Well, I feel like you and I, Amos, we're really bouncing back and forth between the things we're saying. Very spontaneous. But so I think the second part, it's easy to see why. It's pretty straightforward to see why it is that theism would predict a greater number of people on average, or a greater probability of there being the most people that there could be than atheism, where the idea is that it's good to create. God has no limit on how much he can create. So he can still just create the maximum number, the maximum cardinality of people. And note, to create the maximum number of people that could exist, he doesn't have to create every possible person. This is for a slightly technical reason. Two infinite sets can be the same size, even if one of them has members that the other one doesn't, and they otherwise have overlapping members. So for example, they're the same number of prime numbers as natural numbers, even though every prime number is a natural number, but not every natural number is a prime number. But okay, so it's easy to see why. On theism, it's not that unlikely that God would make the most number of people that there could be. While on atheism, it's pretty unlikely, because you just need a lot of, if you were told there is no God, how many people would you expect? Well, probably zero. But if you get any, you certainly wouldn't expect more people than there are numbers. Like, come on, that's not what you would expect as the most likely assumption. But if there's a God, well, you'd expect him to do tons and tons of creating, because it's really good to create, especially if you're going to give the people you create an infinitely good afterlife. And so, their lives will be infinitely amazing on the whole. But so then the only remaining step of the argument that needs defending is the self-indication assumption that your existence is likelier if there are more people that exist. So why I think this is right? Well, there are lots of arguments for it. On my blog, I've amassed about 27-ish arguments for it. Now, when you amass 27 arguments for anything, they're not all going to be winners, but I think at least there's a decent number of them that are pretty good. In particular, I'll just describe one of them, which I think is really decisive. So let's just consider a simple case. Suppose one person's created, and then a coin is flipped, and if it comes up tails, 9 other people are created. Well, if it comes up heads, no other people are created. Okay, so one person created, coins flipped, tails, 9 more people, heads, no more people. Okay, suppose you're created and you don't know your birth rank. So you don't know if you're the first person, if you're the second person, if you're the third person. And then suppose someone tells you, oh, actually, you're the first person. You're told that. Well, if you don't accept the SIA, then you inevitably get the result that after learning you're the first person, you should think that the fair coin that will be flipped but hasn't yet, you ought to think that the odds that it will come up heads are 10 times likelier than the odds that it will come up tails. Where the idea is, okay, so on SIA, a upon being created, because if it comes up tails, there are 10 people, and there's only one if it comes up heads. On SIA, after being created, you should think that it's 10 times likelier that it came up heads than tails. But then you learn that you're the first person, which has a 1 in 10 probability if it came up tails, and a 100% probability if it came up heads. So you started out thinking that tails was 10 times likelier than heads. Then you learn something that's 10 times as likely if it comes up heads and if it comes up tails. So the probabilities cancel out. So therefore, if you adopt SIA, you should think with equal probability that the coin will come up heads and tails. But if you reject SIA, so you're created, you think it's equally likely that the coin comes up heads and tails. Then you learn that you're the first person, which is 10 times likelier if it comes up heads than tails. And so now you should think at 10 to 1 odds that a fair coin that has not been flipped yet will come up heads. So basically, SIA is the only way to secure the result that if a fair chancy event will happen in the future, then you should think that the odds of it turning out some way equal the objective probability of it turning out that way. So like your credence in a coin, in a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet, coming up heads ought to be 0.5. Sorry, I know that was all a bit technical. If you want sort of more details about this, I have a long article on my blog called The Ultimate Guide to the Anthropic Argument, where I sort of
maybe there are some more kind of vivid reductios for rival views with regard to, Adam and Eve having psychic powers, etc.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to explain some of this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can't remember.
Okay, I could explain that. Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another Adam and Eve one. Okay, so Adam and Eve are in the garden. They're the first two people, but they don't know that. And God tells them, look, there are two possibilities. Possibility one is that basically there are only going to be two people throughout all of human history. And possibility two is that there will be, just huge numbers of people, let's say Googleplex people, just a vast number of people where the first two people give birth to tons and tons of people. So Adam and Eve, they say, so not adopting SIA, they think, okay, well, I think these are equally likely, because even though the second one, that there's lots and lots of people, predicts more people, well, as an SIA rejector, they don't think that makes it likelier that they would exist. But then they're told, actually, you are the first two people. Well, the odds that they would be the first two people, given that there are Googleplex people, is 2 over Googleplex, which is basically 0. And so if you adopt if you accept SIA, then yes, the odds of them being the first two people are really low, but that's canceled out by the fact that it's Googleplex times likelier that they would exist if they're Googleplex people. So after learning they're the first two people, then they don't get any weird information about how future events will turn out. But if you think that that they don't start with a higher credence in the hypothesis on which they're Googleplex people, then after getting this Googleplex 1 update in favor of the hypothesis that there are only two people, now they should be basically certain that they won't have any offspring. So now, just by learning they're the first two people and learning that if they have kids, they'll have a lot of kids, they can be basically certain that they won't have kids. So now they have the safest form of birth control imaginable, because if they have sex, they know they won't have any offspring, because if they have offspring, they'll have a lot of them, and then that makes it improbable that they're the first two people. And they can gain psychic powers by making it so that they agree to reproduce, unless like a deer drops dead at their feet, and then they're super confident that a deer drops dead at their feet. Or they can be confident that if God tells them that he'll create a bunch of people after them, unless they get 10 royal flushes in poker. Now they can be like almost 100% certain that they'll get 10 royal flushes in poker. So basically, if you want to maintain the result that you should not be almost certain that ridiculously improbable events will happen in the future when you have no evidence that they'll happen, you have to adopt SIA. Incidentally, I also have a paper on this called Alternatives to the Self-Indication Assumption Are Doomed, where I show this in more detail. So check this out if you want to read more about it.
Awesome. So I think it's a really good rundown of what's being presented in the argument, the Anthropic argument. So I don't want to since we only have enough time for one episode, I don't want to get too bogged down in the technicalities of the SIA, the self-indicating assumption. So I think it's just worth noting that the like y'all have already said, the self-indicating assumption has a lot in favor of accepting it. And sure, there's ways in which I don't want to seem like I'm dismissing the pushback that there could be for the SIA. But really, what's interesting about this argument is what happens when you take it for granted. So if we come to the argument under the assumption that we accept the SIA, and then obviously we all accept the fact that we exist, what interesting follows from that argument? And I think that's where the real interesting meat of the argument happens is if we have some sort of naturalistic hypothesis on the one hand, and a theistic hypothesis on the other, isn't it more likely that the theistic hypothesis has the resources to predict all of these great numbers of people, which then make our existence likely? So let's, for the sake of argument, go ahead and put the SIA on the table and see what happens when we accept the other. You said there were two claims that are really important to defend, one being the SIA, the self-indicating assumption. I'm sorry, I'm talking in acronyms. I know I shouldn't be. We'll take the self-indicating assumption for granted. And then the second is that probability judgment, that it's more likely that we would have that sufficient number of people to make our existence likely, given theism, rather than some sort of naturalistic, atheistic hypothesis. And so let's see what happens. I kind of want to see what y'all's responses are and how your paper would engage with this, because the first naturalistic response. Oh, there's got to be a better way of saying that. The most natural way for the naturalist to respond to this is to just kind of bite the bullet and say that, yeah, like the fact that I exist is a miracle. In fact, hundreds of millions of sperm vie for a single egg, and the chances of my mother and my father being born at the times in which they were and meeting under the circumstances in which they did and copulating when they did and then giving rise to me is something of like a thermodynamic miracle. And so that we are just, it's very improbable that we are here, and that part of that gives our lives meaning. What would you say to the naturalist who just kind of bites the bullet and says that even that we know the SIA is true, and even that we know that we exist, and the SIA implies that we existing is very, very improbable, that's just a fact about us?
Right. So
Yeah, I mean, shall I take this one?
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, yeah. So okay, it's true, right? That there are lots of kind of improbable facts in the build-up to your existence. So particular people meeting particular people, and a particular sperm meeting a particular egg, blah blah blah. And so before the anthropic argument was invented, I don't think many people were saying that this particular chain of causal events is much evidence for theism over atheism, right? And the reason that is because theism doesn't predict that chain of events better than atheism, right? So like, there's no non-ad hoc hypothesis that predicts this particular chain better than just any other hypothesis, right? And so that's why there isn't going to be evidence for theism based on this very specific causal chain in the build-up to you existing. But what we're claiming is that there is a non-ad hoc hypothesis, theism, that makes your existence more likely, and naturalism makes it less likely. And so that's why you should get the update, right? And to make this vivid, like there are lots of cases where I think everyone should agree that the fact that you exist can make other facts more likely, right? So consider two hypotheses. Your parents are infertile and your parents are not infertile, right? So the fact that you are conceived by them makes the hypothesis that your parents are fertile more likely than the hypothesis that your parents are infertile. And what we're suggesting is that you should do a similar kind of update here. So that there's one theory that makes your existence more likely and one theory that makes it vanishingly less likely. And we just say, given that you exist, you should update in favor of the theory that makes your existence more likely.
Right. So regarding the point about whether you should just accept that it's a miracle. So if the self-indication assumption is right, then your existence is likelier by a factor of x on a theory that says that x times as many people exist. So a theory that says there are 10 times as many people makes your existence 10 times likelier. A theory that says that there is 1,000 times as many people makes your existence 1,000 times as likely. A theory that says there are infinitely more people than another makes your existence infinitely likely. So if that's right, then your existence on a theistic theory on which the number of people that exists is the most that there could be will be infinitely higher than an atheistic theory on which it's some smaller amount than that. And normally you should not believe a hypothesis if you get an infinitely strong update in favor of an alternative hypothesis that doesn't start out infinitely improbable. And if theism does start out infinitely improbable, well, I think we'd need an argument for that.
Mm-hmm. So, I think, the right move for the atheist will be to reject some step of the argument, not accept this miracle. Because, sometimes you should just believe really improbable things because there are various virtues to accepting a theory that has a big cost. But if this argument is right...
Did you give an illustrated example for the audience, something like winning the lottery? We know that someone has to win the lottery, but the fact that someone won the lottery isn't a fact about them that we would say calls for further explanation. Is that right? Kind of the idea?
Yeah, so here's maybe an analogy. Yeah, so suppose that there's an infinitely large lottery that contains an infinite number of people, and there are two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that everyone wins, and the second hypothesis is that only one person wins. If you win, then you should not say, oh, maybe I just got lucky. No, it's infinitely unlikely that you got lucky relative to the hypothesis on which everyone got lucky. And so similarly, on the hypothesis that only a finite number of people, or Aleph null, which is the smallest infinity people, get created, you're one of the 0% of possible people that get created. You should not think that you're infinitely lucky in that respect, that you're one of the 0% of possible people who are created. On theism, you can think that the number of people that exist is the most people that there could be, and so then it's infinitely likely relative to the atheistic theory that you would come to exist.
Awesome. So, conceding the point that the naturalist shouldn't just accept their existence as a thermodynamic miracle, that there is some fact here that calls for further explanation, and that the real heavy lifting of the argument seems to be the claim that the fact you exist, or that a lot of people, this infinitely large set of people, is much more likely given a theistic hypothesis than it is given a naturalist hypothesis. And so that the place, like Emma said, is if you're going to attack the argument, the place is to attack it at one of these steps. And so if we're conceding the self-indicating assumption, this would be the step to attack. So the second most natural assumption or objection for the skeptic to raise here is to say that one or the other, or possibly both, of the probability judgments essential here are in fact inscrutable. So the idea that even if we were to assume that there was a perfect being or some sort of disembodied mind that was worthy of worship, what that being would do in the world, the divine psychology of that being, so to speak, is inscrutable, or that it is vanishingly small or vanishingly unlikely on naturalism that this large set of people would exist. One or the other of these probability judgments is inscrutable. And if that's the case, then when we plug it into the Bayes theorem, we're going to run into problems. How would you kind of push back on that skeptical route, saying that these probability judgments aren't really based on anything theoretically that strong and are in fact inscrutable?
So
Right.
should we kind of split the debate? So shall I say, why?
Yeah, tackle it however you think is the best way to approach it.
Should I say, why theism makes it likely that there are lots of possible people, and then you say, why atheism doesn't make it as likely that there are lots of possible people? So, okay, you might start out being a skeptical theist, and you might think, we have no idea what's going on in God's mind. We could make no predictions with regard to what God would do. Okay, I think what we should do is just respond with arguments for why we would expect God to take this course of action. Okay, so here are two reasons why we might expect a perfect and loving God to create lots of possible people. Okay, the first is it's good to create people and then give them a net positive life. That just seems true in the human case. Imagine you had a button that could just create 1 billion people who would live happy lives. Seems like you should press that button, or at least that you have moral reason to press that button, even if you're not strictly obligated to. And, in the case of God, it seems like God is going to be omni-rational, so he's going to comply with the reasons that he has, including his moral ones. And so there's going to be a moral reason for him to press the button and create all of these people. Second, you might think God, a loving being, also has reasons of love, and these reasons of love might lead him to create people so that he can have loving relationships with them. So, these are two stories you can tell. There are probably others for why God would create lots of people. Now, lots of the motivations for being very skeptical about probability judgments about what God would do have to do with things like butterfly effects. So, if we look at the world in response to the problem of evil, some people say, well, there are these inscrutable causal chains connecting lots of events, and we have no idea, what God's plan is or whatever. But these arguments sort of circumvent those issues entirely, because creating all the possible people, or just lots of possible people, is like a precondition for all of those causal chains between different people. It's not something that should be affected by a worry about not being able to see what God's plan is in the end, because the causal chains are so hard to follow. Yeah.
So I think
before, are you going to pick up on his, or are you going to move on to the naturalist probability judgment?
Yeah, I was gonna pick up on what Amos said.
Okay, go ahead.
So right, I mean, I think you don't want to say that all these probabilities are completely inscrutable, because then, for example, you'd have to say that if the initial conditions spelled out made by God with love in every human language, that you throw up your hands and say that it's inscrutable. So I think that you can say that the odds, we don't know exactly what they are without saying they're inscrutable. Just like I would say, for example, that I don't know exactly what the odds are that J.K. Rowling would write exactly the words in Harry Potter. In fact, I couldn't tell you the odds of that to within 10 orders of magnitude, to within 20 orders of magnitude. But nonetheless, I know that the odds are way higher than the odds that that number of people would exist given than the odds that, say, a robot wrote Harry Potter, or that someone else, plagiarized Harry Potter and had it be, under a fake name or something.
Whether it's produced by quantum fluctuation, right?
Right. You can have relative probability judgments, even if you can't even ballpark the absolute probabilities of the events. And so when it comes to the anthropic stuff, it's pretty likely on theism, given that it follows from these plausible assumptions that we talked about. On theism, given that we exist, we should think God wants to create. That's at least not that unlikely. But if he's going to create, it would be kind of weird if he cut off his creation after creating like 110 billion people. It seems like he would either create as much as possible or not at all. It would be kind of weird if he created some arbitrary amount in the middle. And then I think we have these principled reasons to think that he would create a lot. And so on theism, I think you'd expect with decent probability the most people that there could be. In contrast, on naturalism, if you look at any of the existing, the number of naturalistic views on which you get the right number of people is basically 2. It's like modal realism, which says every possible world exists, and a view on which every mathematical structure is instantiated. And I think both of these views undermine induction. So my view is that basically no atheist in the history of the world has proposed a view that doesn't collapse induction, that gets you the right number of people. if that's right, then you should think that it's pretty unlikely that atheism does get you the right number of people without having egregiously skeptical implications. Like if no one who in the history of the world who adopts theory A has ever come up with an explanation of how you get X given A, you should probably think, okay, the odds of X given A are not that high, especially if it seems like you need a great degree of gerrymandering to get X, and all the natural versions of getting A. All the natural versions of X don't get you A, but get you something very different.
Ben, just before you jump in, maybe one more comment on skeptical theism.
Sure, go right ahead.
I mean, the leading motivation for being this excessively skeptical about what God would do is to do away with the problem of evil. And I think mine and Matthew's view about this is just cope from certain theists. So, like, it's not not a well-motivated move initially. And once you apply this very excessive skepticism with regard to evil, the skepticism bleeds out. And I think what will end up entailing is that you have no reason to believe that it's good to save a drowning child who's right in front of you, because you have no idea what the rate of your reasons are. I think it'll end up undermining all of the good natural theological arguments, all of the evidential ones, because you have no reason to think that God would be more likely to create a fine-tuned universe, or create you in this case, or perform a miracle. And I think it will also imply global skepticism in the end, because imagine you knew that your cognitive faculties had been produced by this process, where the probability that the process would produce a truth-conducive mind was completely inscrutable. Then I think that would just give you a defeater for thinking that your cognitive faculties are reliable. And so in the same way, if you accept this view that your cognitive faculties were produced by this being, and you have no greater reason to think that the being would produce a set of reliable cognitive faculties than unreliable ones, then you just get a defeater for the reliability of your cognitive faculties. And so skeptical theism has all of these problems. It's way too skeptical. It doesn't seem initially motivated. Whatever the right solution to the problem of evil is, it's not this.
Gotcha. So I know we had talked about moving on to the naturalist, the probability judgment that it's low, at least lower than theism on the naturalist assumption. But I want to get at least one more objection in, and just kind of we'll be able to end the this episode with this objection, because I'm very interested to see how you would reply to it. So Paul Draper has put forward an argument that he calls decisive evidence against theism. And so the argument uses a competing hypothesis. So he's drawing off of Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion and comparing theism with alternative hypotheses. And so he puts forward an aesthetic deism. So on this hypothesis, God is more concerned about aesthetic considerations than he is about moral considerations. And so the argument is that this hypothesis is an atheistic one, at least in a narrow sense, that it denies perfect being theism, and is not more probable intrinsically, or perfect being theism is not much more probable intrinsically than aesthetic deism. And that aesthetic deism predicts this large set of numbers, a number of people, equally as well as perfect being theism. However, to kind of draw it back to the comments that you were making about the problem of evil, aesthetic deism explains the facts that we observe about evil and about religious confusion, widespread religious disagreement, better than the perfect being theism. And so by Bayes' theorem, that the fact that hypothesis logically incompatible with theism, it turns out to be more problem. That entails a prima facie good reason to reject perfect being theism. How would y'all approach a response like that from someone like Paul Draper? I think Joe Schmid just did a video as well.
Great video.
On this argument. So I'll put a link in the description for people who might not be familiar, because I realize that this is kind of a complicated mess of competing hypotheses and probability theory and different observations. But I'm just curious as to see how y'all would approach something like this.
Yeah, shall I take it and then you?
Yeah.
So, okay. My response to aesthetic deism is just that I think it's less intrinsically probable. So, contra Paul Draper, I think it's like much less intrinsically probable. I think this for sort of two main reasons. So the first is I think there's a sort of common intuition when it comes to the intrinsic probability of theism, which I think is correct, which is that maxed out omni properties are simpler than are going to be simpler than ones with sort of arbitrary cutoff. So, like it's going to be simpler to say God is all powerful rather than powerful to some, n finite degree. And when it comes to God's omni-rationality, I think aesthetic deism suffers quite a lot. So if you're a moral realist, you're going to think that there are moral reasons. And so if there's a being who complies with aesthetic reasons, but not moral ones, then there's this sort of cutoff with his rationality where, an omni-rational being would be fully reason responsive. He would respond to all of his reasons, his aesthetic reasons, if there are any, his epistemic reasons, pragmatic reasons, and his moral reasons. And aesthetic deism just sort of lops off the moral reasons. And so I think that will sink the prior of aesthetic deism quite a bit. A second, I think I'm just more skeptical that there are stance-independent aesthetic reasons than there are stance-independent moral reasons. It'll probably be too long-winded to get into why I think that. But that's another reason to be more skeptical of aesthetic deism. So you might wonder, whether it predicts the existence of lots of people as well too. I think probably there'll be a story you can tell. Maybe it's just beautiful to have, a very large infinity of people across worlds. That's probably true, right? So an artist might just want to create as many paintings as possible, and so as many paintings as possible will include as many people as possible. So I think I agree that aesthetic deism will have, a decent story of why God would create all possible people, but I think that its intrinsic probability is much lower. Matthew?
Yeah,
So
I agree.
just,
I think that...
sorry. I wanted to just make a clarifying remark, or allow for one. So Paul Draper formulates intrinsic probability in terms of coherence and modesty. And so I don't think you're trying to say that the aesthetic deism is less coherent of a hypothesis than perfect being theism, but it is one that is more immodest. Would that be accurate?
I think so. I mean, I don't know exactly how he cashes out immodesty, so I'd have to like.
Immodesty would be so it's the content that we put into the hypothesis. So hypotheses that are just loaded with content are going to be much less probable intrinsically because they're going to have more ways of being false. And then coherence is cashed out in how all those pieces fit together. Mm-hmm. And his theory of intrinsic probability, I realize, is also particular to him because he very specifically says that intrinsic probability is a measure of coherence, modesty, and nothing else. And I heard you use the term prior probability earlier, which would be conditioning on background knowledge, which is slightly different, but I still think it's important. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I was wondering if you would make the move of saying that aesthetic deism was more immodest than perfect being theism because it had more content in it. By reducing the level of moral perfection to some arbitrary number less than infinite would somehow add more content to the hypothesis, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I suspect that what I'm saying maps onto Draper's view in that way. I'd have to check how he's using the term modesty in his view. But my complaint certainly is about the content, so probably that's where the rubber meets the road.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would suspect that. So I have a similar complaint, but I would suspect that basically, like, what this shows is that there are more things on heaven and earth that are dreamt of in Draper's theory of prior probabilities. So, for example, the hypothesis that
Great
space,
Shakespeare reference there. Well done. I applaud that.
So the hypothesis that space is infinite in size is just as modest as the hypothesis that space is exactly 7 quadrillion meters across. But nonetheless, the theory that it's infinite in size has a much higher prior probability. So I think that it's not just going to be about how much it asserts about the world and how coherent it is. I mean, I also think coherence will just push the puzzle back a level to what determines which parts of the world fit together. And then you'll need some meta theory to figure out which features are likely to go together, which will have to appeal to a criterion like simplicity. So I think that when it comes to theoretical virtues, there are a few that Draper's not taking into account, which include simplicity and elegance. Simplicity is how many things you think there are, or how many kinds of things, or how long it takes to describe things. There are different counts, but something like that. And elegance is how sort of how much non-arbitrariness there is in the theory. So I think theism is a really simple and elegant theory because it just posits, in my view, there are 3 kinds of things: minds, physical stuff, and abstract objects. It just posits that there's one of these things, a mind, completely without limit. So it's maybe the simplest way reality can be, where it's just a fundamental thing instantiated wholly without limit. You can do that with physical stuff or with abstract objects. So it's very elegant and it's very simple. It's true that it's immodest, so it says a lot about the world, but often simplicity is enough to make up for a great immodesty. So for example, the theory that the laws of nature are uniform is very immodest because it rules out lots of different ways that the laws could be non-uniform. But nonetheless, we think that it's way more likely that the laws are uniform than that they break down in some random patch of space-time. Now, regarding aesthetic deism, I think the problem with aesthetic deism is that it has a prior of 0, which is that I mean, maybe not quite that, but I mean, I think probably the best theory will actually turn out that it has a prior of 0, because there are an infinite number of things that a god might care about, right? You could have aesthetic deism, or you could have French fryist deism, where a god only cares about maximizing French fries, or you could have triangle deism, where a god just cares about maximizing the number of triangles. There are an infinite number of these things, and so I think the prior probability of just any one of these is just going to be 0, right? Because your credence will be split across the infinite number of ways that of random things that God might care about. Now you might wonder, okay, why doesn't this apply to a perfect being? The idea is that once you have a limitless mind, this limitless mind, because it has no limits, it would have no limit on its power or knowledge, so it would know everything, and then it would be motivated to follow the moral fact. Because there's a plausible principle that when you recognize that something is good, if you're fully rational and don't have any conflicting motivation, you'll be motivated to bring it about. So just a completely limitless mind would be motivated to pursue the good. But if you don't have a limitless mind pursuing the good, then it's totally arbitrary why they're pursuing beauty rather than even an infinite number of other things. I also don't think that aesthetic deism has very much of an explanatory advantage over theism, because I mean, I think aesthetic deism still has a problem of evil, because it's a pretty big coincidence that these blind, indifferent naturalistic processes happen to be the most aesthetically pleasing when they certainly don't seem to be. And it also has to struggle with a problem of ugliness and hideousness and revulsion. And I actually think the theistic theodicies are probably better than the aesthetic deist hypotheses. The last point is that I think aesthetic deism, there are lots of things that theism explains okay, where aesthetic deism doesn't explain them quite as well. And so then aesthetic deism just takes hit after hit from these small bits. So it loses out massively on priors, and then it takes small hits from every bit of evidence. So for example, take the moral knowledge argument. Maybe moral knowledge is aesthetically desirable, but I don't know that it is. I think we're somewhat in the dark about that, but it's more likely that it's morally desirable. Okay, so then I think theism predicts moral knowledge with higher probability than aesthetic deism. Okay, maybe it would be maximally beautiful for you to get the most people that there could be, but that's not that obvious. It might not be. And so the Anthropic argument, I think, will favor theism by some amount over aesthetic deism, because it's more likely to get the right number of people. Is psychophysical harmony aesthetically pleasing? Probably, but it's more obvious that it's morally desirable. There's something aesthetically pleasing about sort of nothing existing at all. So maybe aesthetic deism doesn't predict the existence of a physical world as well. I just think aesthetic deism will just take small hits on every single bit of evidence and starts out with a ridiculously low prior, probably a prior of 0, which all things considered makes it far inferior to the theistic theory. Just like the theory that it makes it so that the aesthetic deist theory is equivalent to the theory that there's a God maximizing for argon, where that's a really bad theory, because why would they maximize argon rather than something else?
All right, guys. So that brings us kind of to the close of our discussion here. This was really good. I'd like to give both of you an opportunity now to kind of plug your Substacks, blogs, channels, where people, if they're interested in finding out more about your work, where they can find you.
Yeah, so, friends, real atheology listeners, countrymen, lend me your ears. Another Shakespeare reference. So, I blog at Going AWOL. I think, most of the interesting stuff is there. If you want to read my academic papers, I have a Phil People profile. I had/have, I guess, a YouTube channel called Ends and Means, where I hosted some interviews on applied ethics. There's a debate between Philip Goff and Michael Humer, for example, on whether taxation is theft. There's a debate about the ethics of monogamy, whether it's immoral to be monogamous. Some interesting stuff over there, maybe. And then, I tweet my tweets at Going AWOL also. So you can find me there.
And so I have a blog called Bentham's Newsletter, which you can find by either Googling Bentham's Newsletter or Bentham's Bulldog. I also have a YouTube channel called The Liberation Under Ideal Conditions, where I host chats with philosophers. It's mostly about philosophy of religion, but occasionally about other stuff. The blog's more diverse. It's less consistently about philosophy of religion. It's about a more diverse array of topics. And then I also have a Twitter that's just Bentham's Bulldog. So you can find me at any of those places. I'd say my ranking of them from best to worst would be blog, YouTube channel, Twitter, but I think, they're all fine.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, I really do appreciate you coming on and
oh wait, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just one brief thing to mention. So I know the anthropic argument is sort of complicated and hard to think about. If you want more details about it, I have an article on my blog called "The Ultimate Guide to the Anthropic Argument," where I lay it out in more detail, and I go through basically all the objections and explain why I don't think any of them are any good. So you can see it there. I also, if you want a more sort of briefer introduction to it, it'll probably be out by the time this episode is released on Pat Flynn's blog. I think it's called The Journal of Absolute Truth. Decent odds that I'll have an article up on there that provides a sort of more basic and introductory level explanation of the anthropic argument. That's sort of less technical and more written. That doesn't address as many of the objections, but that's more written to just make it clear what the argument's saying, and that addresses sort of some of the main objections. So, and hopefully Amos will have an article about it soon.
Yeah.
Awesome. Again, thank you guys for coming on the show, giving us your time, walking us through that argument and some of the objections. And so I hope that people can use this to constructively work through their journeys in the philosophy of religion.